we've heard from the military, from the State Department, and from the administration that they have not received much communication in response regarding Private King.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, we've had an incident where we have a soldier who's being held apparently in North Korea. A lot of discussion and controversy about whether he intentionally went over there, what his status is, a lack of communication about that status. What do we know?
So on Tuesday morning, Private Travis King was supposed to get on a flight from South Korea intended for him to go to Texas. He at the time had just sort of gotten out of a South Korean prison where he served a short stint for an incident or an altercation with local police.
Right.
Upon his release, he spent a couple days under U.S. supervision, and the U.S. was supposed to get him on this flight. They dropped him off at the airport, but they had no reason to suspect he would do anything different.
Right.
They did not follow him all the way into the terminal. They didn't watch him get on the plane, and it turns out he didn't. He turned around, he got on a tour of the DMZ, of the sort of border between the north and the south, and then he made a break for it, and he just crossed the border. And so from the minute he did that, the U.S. has no idea what happened to him. Mm-hmm. The U.S. is under the assumption that he is being detained by the North Korean military, but the North Korean military hasn't been responsive to the U.S. military's outreach. Mm-hmm. We've heard from the military, from the State Department, and from the administration that they have not received much communication in response regarding Private King.
Right.
Part of this that makes it so confusing and so interesting is, by all accounts, he did this on his own. He chose to make a run for it, and we don't really know exactly why. We don't know if this was a plan. We don't know if he had been in contact.
Was he a defector? Or?
We don't know if he was in contact with the North Koreans ahead of time. A lot of this is unknown, but the U.S. is trying to get him back, which raises an interesting question as to whether or not he wants to come back to the States at all, given he decided not to do that.
Mm-hmm. So the situation in the Black Sea has been an object of great concern. The Russians are under pressure to re-enter a grain deal because of global food prices. What is the sort of situation right now, which is looking kind of precarious?
So to take a step back, this time last year, Turkey and the UN brokered an agreement between Ukraine and Russia to allow Ukrainian grain exports to leave the ports.
Right.
And this was a big deal because they tally tens of millions of pounds of grain, every year. Mm-hmm. And so they're one of the largest suppliers of grain globally. And so in the time before this deal had come this time last year, we'd already seen the effects that their hold on Ukrainian ports was having globally. So over the last year or so, the deal has gone in spurts, 3 months at a time, 6 months at a time, and each time Russia sort of went back to the table and said, we want more concessions to allow this to continue. Sure. Once again, that happened, and the negotiations sort of went the extra step of Russia officially pulling out of this agreement. And so now we've heard from Russian officials say that they will assume that any vessel in the Black Sea, for example, will potentially be carrying military equipment meant for Ukraine, which means any vessel is at risk. And we also heard today from the Biden administration that they are concerned about a false flag operation being conducted by the Russians, where they have put additional sea mines, like landmines, but in the water, and that they could detonate at any time, injuring whatever ship is in the area, and then they would point the finger at Ukraine. And so this really is a new development in the war, where much of what has happened has been on land, and we're still waiting to see exactly how Ukraine can respond.
And of course, this is all happening against the backdrop of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which by most accounts is going slowly.
That's exactly right. We've heard from specifically military leaders lately acknowledging that it is a difficult fight ahead, but at the same time, we're seeing leaders show their resolve and remain committed to Ukraine. We saw earlier this week the U.S. come out with a new aid package for roughly $1.3 billion over an extended period of time. One of these packages that they do through the Ukraine security initiative in which they essentially pay defense companies to start creating or start building the military aid that they provide. And it's much more of a long-term plan, but it shows once again that the U.S. and their allies are thinking long-term as it relates to helping Ukraine.
So finally, Senator Tommy Tuberville's hold on military promotions is really starting to come to a head. It factors into the NDAA debate as well. Give us a little bit of an update on where things stand right now.
So right now, everyone remains dug into their position, and we haven't seen much movement in that regard, but we have seen a lot of communication back and forth. Secretary Austin and Senator Tuberville have spoken twice in the past 2 weeks on the subject, neither of whom are willing to budge. And then DoD leaders briefed the Senate Armed Services Committee earlier this week regarding the policy. And even following that briefing, which was a closed-door briefing, we heard members of each party once again double down on their side. We heard the ranking member say, abortions under this policy can be provided or accommodated, late into a pregnancy.
Right.
Whereas we heard the chairman, a Democrat, say, he believes now, more officially than he had before, that this is 100% a legal policy. And so either way, we've heard both sides remain entrenched in their position, neither of whom seem ready to budge.
But it's a dispute over the Pentagon's policy of travel reimbursement for service members or their dependents seeking abortions.
Exactly. And so this goes back to the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. In light of that, the Pentagon felt like they needed some sort of policy or some sort of guidance on how to handle a service member or a service member dependent who needs an abortion but is in a state that doesn't have abortion access. And so what we've heard from the department and what they implemented, as you mentioned, was a policy in which they don't pay for the abortion outright, but they're willing to reimburse a service member or a dependent's travel expenses, whether that's airfare or a hotel,
right,
or driving. And part of it is there are a lot of questions that still remain on the policy about which state they could seek this procedure because, as Senator Wicker, the top Republican, said, abortion could be provided in a late-term pregnancy in this case. That's only relevant if they seek an abortion in a state that allows that.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.